So let's look at drafting the size 8 women's wear sleeve. Now remember, we measured the back and front armhole in the last video. If you have not done that, please do so. I will be working with the measurements that I have, which came out to 8 inches on the front armhole and 8 1/4 inches on the back armhole. But please, please, please use the measurements that you get from your front and back bodice drafts, as it may be different. To start, we're going to have to do some calculations. Remember, most if not all of sewing is math. We're going to take our front armhole measurement and our back armhole measurement, and we're going to add these two measurements together. We will then take this total armhole measurement and divide it in half. From this number, we will then add 1/4 of an inch. From these calculations, we should have the armhole measurement that we'll need for drafting our sleeve. As usual, the measurements that I will be using will be posted in the description below, as well as here in the video itself. I will be drafting with a series of pens and markers just so it's easier to see on the video, but I recommend that you draft with a sharpened pencil so that you can make any changes if need be. I will try to go through this draft as quickly and concisely as possible, so please speed the video up, slow it down, rewind it, rewatch it, whatever you need to do to fully understand the content. And as usual, any misstep during the drafting process could throw off the entire draft, so please take your time with this. Cut yourself a piece of pattern paper 22 to 24 inches long and at least 12 to 16 inches tall. Then let's find the middle of this paper. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can eyeball it, or you can fold your paper in half, place a small crease, and mark where the middle of your page is. Along this mark, on the halfway point of the page, we're going to draft a line from A to B. That is the sleeve length measurement. That's 21 3/4 of an inch. This will be point A down to point B. From point A, we're going to measure along this line the cap height measurement. That is 5 5/8 of an inch. So that will be point C. From point C, we're going to measure from C to D. That'll be 1/2 of C to B. So I'm going to fold my paper until point C and point B match up. Fold and mark the halfway point. That will be point D. From D, up 3/4 of an inch. This will be point D1. Now I'm going to square out lines from A, C, D1, and B. I'm going to focus in on point A and line C for a moment. I'm going to place my ruler at point A with 0 at point A and pivot my ruler. Keeping the 0 point at A, I'm going to pivot my ruler until my armhole measurement touches line C. Again, placing the 0 point of my ruler at A, pivoting until my armhole measurement, which was 8 3/8, lines up with line C. Your measurements may be different. I'll repeat the same in this direction, placing the 0 point of my ruler at point A and pivoting until 8 3/8 of an inch touches line C. For the next step, we want to ensure that these 2 points that we've placed on line C are accurate. So we will take our bicep measure and divide it in half and measure from point C that half bicep measurement in both directions. The half bicep measurement I have is 6 5/16. So I will measure from C 6 5/16 of an inch. And the same from C up in this direction, 6 5/16 of an inch. Now if I zoom in, you may see a little discrepancy. This is where my armhole measurement intersected with line C, and this is where my half bicep measurement lines up. This is pretty negligible, about 1/8 of an inch. If, when you're doing this, you have a major discrepancy between these 2 points, 1/4 of an inch or more, you want to find the midpoint between the two. This is pretty close, so I'm going to go with just the midpoint between the two of them. And the same down here. This is pretty close to each other. Just find the midpoint between the two of them. It's not as noticeable on this draft, but if for some reason you're working on a draft where there's a large space between them, you can make those changes. So wherever you decide these final bicep points will be, we will have point E down here and point F up here. Because there's such a small discrepancy between my armhole measurement lines and where my half bicep measurements are, I'm going to keep my armhole measurement lines as they are. If you find that there's that major discrepancy and you have to push your point F or your point E in either direction, please redraft A to E and A to F so you get the correct angle of these two lines. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to keep the 2 lines that I have. And I'm going to divide each of these lines into quarters. So I will fold my paper from A to F and find the midpoint, and fold them again to find my quarter points. A to F to find the midpoint, and then from A to the midpoint, and F to the midpoint, and the same along my A to E line. I'm going to mark each of these 6 points with the following. This will be point G, H, K, L, M, and N. From points E and F, I'm going to draft some squared out lines to line B. Where these 2 new points land on line B, measure in by 2 inches from either point. So 2 inches in towards B, and another 2 inches in towards B. This will be point O and point P. Draft the new underarm seams from E to O and F to P. This creates a tapered sleeve, but know that you could keep these original lines to create a straight sleeve. For the rest of this draft, I'm going to be focusing up here on the sleeve cap. We don't need to make any more changes to the rest of the sleeve. We've got our biceps established, our elbow line at line D1 and our wrist line at line B, and we've tapered in the seams that go underneath the arm. That's taken care of, and let's focus on the sleeve cap. To do so, I'm going to rotate my paper and zoom in on the sleeve cap so you can clearly see what I am doing. From each of these points, as they lie along these 2 lines, we're going to measure above and below the lines. From each of these 6 points along both of these lines, we're going to extend some squared out lines either above or below our armhole measurement line. I'm going to run through these pretty fast, but please, please, please take your time when drafting them. From point G, we're going to square a line below the armhole measurement line by 3/8 of an inch. From H, we're going to square up 1/4 of an inch. From K, we will square up 5/8 of an inch. From L, we'll square up 3/4 of an inch. From M, we will square up 3/16. From N, we will square down 1/2 an inch. Next, I'll be drawing my sleeve cap, and I'm going to use an erasable pen. Please use a pencil or an erasable pen when you do this because this curve is going to change. Using my French curve, I want to follow along line A and curve down towards these 2 points on L and M. I'll do the same over here. Following along guideline A, I want to curve through these points at K and H. I'm now going to invert my ruler. I started it with this direction. I'm now going to turn it, and flip it again to join this curve that I just made into the point at N and F. And to finish off, we'll do the same here. We started with the ruler in this orientation. We're going to flip it vertically and horizontally and match up where this curve starts and join it to this point at G and this point at E. Note that the measurements we added to these 6 points are not identical, and neither is our sleeve cap curve. It is not symmetrical across our grain line in the middle here. This is totally normal for a tailored sleeve. I mentioned before that this sleeve cap may change, and now I'm going to find out whether it does. I need to compare the sleeve cap to my front and back armholes. And to do that, I'm going to walk my front armhole to my front sleeve cap and my back armhole to the back of my sleeve cap. I've placed a pinnable work surface on here. If you're working on campus, all of the production tables are pinnable work surfaces. You can pin directly into them. If you're working from home, you can either use some felt or foam or cardboard on your work surface. I'm going to grab 2 sewing pins. Now this is the proper way to walk your seams, is to pin them into a work surface. I want to walk my armhole from point O to point G, and I want to match it to my sleeve cap from point F all the way up along until point A, and we'll see how far it gets. I'm going to take my front bodice and flip it upside down so that the first few curves, you can see there's my armhole curve on my bodice in blue, and you may faintly see the curve of my sleeve cap in red underneath. By flipping my bodice over, I have 2 matching curves to begin with. I'm going to line up points O and F and place a pin through both pieces of paper and into my pinnable work surface. And I'm going to pivot my bodice until it matches the curve of my sleeve cap. As I work my way here, I can see my armhole on the bodice is going this direction while my sleeve cap is diverting off into this direction. Right at the point where they start to divert, I will place my second sewing pin. So I know this looks fine right here. This is walked just perfectly fine. But now I've got to deal with this discrepancy happening here. So I will remove my first pin and again pivot my bodice until it closely matches the curve of the sleeve cap. And again, they divert right about here. So I'll place my pin right where they divert. So I've taken care of this portion and this portion, and I will just continue to work my way up and around. Now here at the top, I've gotten to the end of my sleeve cap, my armhole. It's point G right here. But I still have this much left of my sleeve cap to deal with. This point G will never meet at point A. You have to start at points O and F and see how far your armhole gets. I'm just going to lift up my paper and put a mark on my sleeve draft so I know where my front armhole ends. Again, your front armhole will never get to point A, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to repeat the same with my back armhole. I want to start at point N and walk along the armhole to point H, and I will put point N at point E on my sleeve cap and work my way up towards A and see how far I get. Okay, so my front armhole started at F and stopped at this mark right here. My back armhole started at E and ended right here. I want to measure between these 2 points. I'm going to use my curved ruler to do so. And I've got almost 2 inches. The space between these 2 marks is the ease that's built into your sleeve cap, which is totally normal. When you go to sew a tailored sleeve, you sew ease stitches up and along this top curve of your sleeve cap, and you gather those stitches in so that the fabric rolls into a rounded, almost spherical-esque shape, so that the ball of the shoulder can sit right here on the sleeve. On a tailored sleeve, your sleeve cap will always be larger than your front and back armhole measurements combined. The question is, how much larger should this sleeve cap be? Standard is 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 inches. So I've got about 1/8 of an inch more than what I need here. I need at the very most 1 3/4 inches, and I'm getting 1 7/8 inches. So I've got an extra 1/8 of an inch of ease in there than I need. So I need to adjust the space between these 2 marks, and I want to explain how this will work. Let's say the measurement between these 2 marks is too small and you need to make it larger. Your options are raising your sleeve cap, push it up, redraft it, re-walk your armholes and see if you add more ease. You can push your bicep points out, hence lengthening this curve to add more ease at the cap. If you find you need less ease, as in my example, you can lower the sleeve cap, making this curve slightly shorter. You can take your biceps in if you need to. I don't recommend making the biceps too narrow because this does have to fit all the way around the arm, and if it gets too narrow, the sleeve will be too tight. So unless you need to add tiny little increments, in this case, 1/16 of an inch and 1/16 of an inch from either side to get rid of that extra 1/8 should be fine. But generally speaking, dropping your sleeve cap is your best option if you need to reduce the amount of ease. I'm going to show you one more technique for adding or reducing ease in your sleeve cap that may be a little bit easier rather than redrafting and remeasuring over and over again. To do so, you're going to need a pair of scissors. I'm going to cut through all of my paper along the grain line at the center, stopping at point C. I'll then cut out from C to E and from C to F, and then I'm going to cut in towards points E and F on both sides of my paper. Now that I've made those cuts, I now have some pivot points here at points E and F, and I can open up my sleeve cap, adding more ease in between, or I can overlap my sleeve cap, adding less ease. I've placed a piece of spare paper underneath my draft here so that I can make the necessary adjustments to my sleeve cap. To start off with my spare piece of paper, I want to affix this with some tape or glue to my bicep line. And then I want to extend my grain line from the original draft. Let's say you need to add ease to your sleeve cap. And for the sake of example, let's say we need to add 1/2 inch of ease. In that case, measure 1/4 inch on either side of your grain line and place 2 vertical guidelines, 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch on either side of the grain line. And when you open up these 2 cut pieces, just make sure that these 2 points that used to be point A touch either of those guidelines. Ensure that they touch those guidelines and that the point C still matches. You don't want point C to be doing this or doing that. You want to make sure that point C sits at the same level and that we widen out point A by 1/2 inch. Now I need to reduce the amount of ease in my sleeve cap. I only need to remove 1/8 inch, but for the sake of the demonstration, I'll remove 1/2 inch. Just as before, I would mark 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch on either side of my new grain line. And instead of spreading point A open, I will overlap each point until this touches this guideline and my other piece touches the other 1/2 inch guideline. Again, making sure that point C comes together and that it's not sitting like this or like that. Once I've got those in place, I'll tape them down. Now, if you've added ease, your grain line should still be visible on the piece of paper underneath. But since I've overlapped, I've lost my grain line. So I'm just going to redraft it, again, squaring up from the original grain line that I had, straight through the middle of these overlaps. Once you've established the correct amount of ease, and just to be sure, I can measure between those 2 points, those 2 marks where my front and back armhole ended, and I'm 1 3/8 inches. So we're at a good spot with the amount of ease here. That's looking good. The next things we need to add are notches along our sleeve cap. If you have raised or lowered your sleeve cap or pushed your biceps out and redrafted your sleeve cap, you'll need to walk your front and back armholes again and find these 2 little points because we're going to need those. So the last thing we need to take care of is adding notches to our sleeve. We need to know where the armhole is going to meet up along the back and the front of the sleeve. We also need to know where our shoulder seam is going to go. If you have redrafted your sleeve cap, you've raised it or lowered it or changed your bicep points and redrafted it, please walk your front and back armholes again. Ensure you have the correct amount of ease between those 2 points where those armholes end. And make sure you've marked where the back and the front armhole ends. Once you have these 2 points, you need to find the median, the midpoint between them along this curve. You can measure the distance between the 2 and divide that measurement in half. You can fold the paper until the 2 points touch each other. I'm just going to eyeball it. I can tell that it's sitting somewhere right about here. And I'm going to put a mark where the median between these 2 marks are. This mark that I just placed is the shoulder balance notch. Without these 2 marks, I wouldn't be able to find this one. And when we're installing our sleeve into the front and back armholes, we need to know where the shoulder seam goes. And this notch indicates where the front and back shoulder seam will lay on the sleeve cap. Note that the shoulder balance notch does not align with the grain line. And if you've drafted it properly, it should not line up with your grain line. If your back armhole is longer than your front armhole, it should push your shoulder balance notch towards the front of the sleeve. If you find that your shoulder balance notch is lying on the grain line, that is okay. But if you find that it's laying to the back of the sleeve, something has gone wrong and you'll need to backtrack and redraft. Check the length of your front and back armholes. Be sure that the back armhole is longer than the front, because we definitely want this shoulder balance notch either at or forward of our grain line. The last few notches we need will sit around here to indicate where the sleeve cap lines up with the bodice armholes. It'll also give us a guideline for where to place our ease stitches when we're easing our sleeve cap in. There are a few techniques for doing that, and I will show you both. One is to mark your sleeve cap and then transfer it to your armhole. So I'm going to start at point F and measure about 3 to 3.5 inches along this curve. It does not have to be exact. 3 to 3.5 inches is fine. And I'm just kind of guessing at it. Somewhere around there looks fine. So about 3 inches from F along this curve. Puts a notch right there. I'm going to put one notch because we're working with the front of the armhole, and the front of the body is always indicated with a single notch. I'll grab my front bodice, and again, putting point O at point F, I'll walk along that curve until I find that notch that I just marked right there, and transfer it to my bodice. Now I marked it on the back of my draft, so I'm going to make sure I mark that on the front. So I know when I go to set in my sleeve that these curves should match and that these two notches should sit at the same place. And that the rest of my sleeve is going to get gathered in to fit the rest of my armhole, where G will sit at my shoulder balance notch. So that's one technique for adding those notches, by adding it to the sleeve cap and then transferring it to the armhole. The other option is to add your notches to your armholes and then transfer them to your sleeve cap. I'll do that for the back of my armhole. Again, measuring about 3 to 3.5 inches from point N up along this armhole curve. Doesn't have to be perfect. Now we mark the front of our body with a single notch. Garments are marked with a double notch by default on the back of the body. So I'm going to place 2 notches about 1/4 inch apart. So from point N, that's about 3 inches to this notch, and then another 1/4 inch to the second notch. And then I'm going to place point E on my sleeve cap onto point N. And walk my sleeve cap until I can see those 2 notches that I marked on my bodice. And copy my 2 notches to my back armhole. So when I line up my sleeve cap, I know that my notches are sitting in the same place. And again, that the rest of my sleeve cap would get gathered, eased in to the rest of my armhole where my shoulder balance notch meets my shoulder seam. This takes care of your basic 5 sleeve draft. Do note all of the notches and whatnot that are necessary on all of your drafts. Some seamstresses, some pattern makers will add a dart to the back elbow. I'm not doing that for mine. I can always add it later if I want to, but I like to keep just the tapered sleeve, especially for the samples that we're going to be doing in this class. You won't need that elbow dart.